Welcome to today's podcast of Pursuing Justice. I am Harriet Hendel. We've learned that there happens to be another podcast with the same name, so we have changed our title to Pursuing Justice. For the next 4 podcasts, I will have 3 guests. As I mentioned in my last podcast, I had hoped to focus on a case that dates back to 1976, which took place in Jacksonville, Florida. 2 men, an uncle and his nephew, were wrongly accused of murder. Their names were Clifford Williams Jr. and Hubert Nathan Myers. They spent 43 years behind bars as innocent men. And in March of 2019, they walked out of prison thanks to the tireless work and collaboration of the Innocence Project of Florida and the brand new Conviction Integrity Unit, which is based in Jacksonville. My guests over these next few podcasts will be SHELLEY THIBODEAU, Director of the Conviction Integrity Unit, Krista Dolan, one of 2 lawyers from the Innocence Project of Florida, and Nathan Myers, who was the nephew in the case and 18 years old at the time of his arrest when he was sentenced to life in prison. And now I would like to introduce you to SHELLEY THIBODEAU, who is the director of the Conviction Integrity Unit, the first one of its kind in the state of Florida. As director, she played a key role in the Williams-Myers case. Before we delve into that case, SHELLEY, would you tell us a little bit about the mission and the makeup of a Conviction Integrity Unit and a little bit about your job?
Yes, thank you, Harriet. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak to you for a few minutes this afternoon about conviction integrity. So conviction integrity units are housed within state attorneys' offices. And we act like an in-house Innocence Project. And you've already mentioned briefly the Innocence Project. For your listeners who are not familiar with the Innocence Project, in the late 80s, early 90s, Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck came up with this concept that if DNA, which at that time was a relatively novel piece of evidence, could be used to convict people of crimes such as sexual batteries and homicides, that the reverse would apply, that DNA could be used to exonerate those who were making innocence claims, those who were convicted but said that they had been wrongfully convicted. And so as that concept spread, it's now been incorporated within some state attorneys' offices across the country. So currently there are about 50 conviction integrity units across the country. When Melissa Nelson was elected in 2016 here locally, she decided that she was going to create a conviction integrity unit within our office. And I then started in January of 2018. And at that time, there were no conviction integrity units within the state of Florida. So in essence, we sort of created the concept here in Florida for what we were going to do. And while some conviction integrity units across the country look at both innocence claims and due process violations, our office is strictly looking at innocence claims. And so the way that works is if someone's been convicted and they claim that they were wrongly convicted and in fact were innocent of having committed the crime for which they were convicted, they can petition my office and request a review of their case. And so although we were established in January of 2018, there are now 4 conviction integrity units around the state of Florida. Tampa has a unit, Orlando, and most recently Fort Lauderdale. And while Miami doesn't have a designated conviction integrity unit per se, they have apparently a policy or a procedure for looking at innocence claims. And so the concept is certainly spreading And when I first started in January of 2018, there were 33 units. And like I said, there are now 50. And interestingly, I get calls, quite often from other state attorneys' offices around the state, asking how we got started, what's the process and procedure. And so other units are looking at establishing units as well.
And why did you choose the law as your career?
I am the first person in my family to become a lawyer. And so I don't know that I had a real specific reason for going to law school initially. But what happened while I was in law school, there was a Children's Advocacy Center clinic at FSU. And I volunteered for the Children's Advocacy Clinic. And what they did at that time is they paired you as a student with a juvenile case, a child that was going through juvenile court. And I represented a young man, a teenager, who was arrested for skateboarding on school grounds. And my probably 2-year-old self really had a hard time understanding how a 14-year-old could be arrested for skateboarding on school grounds. And so ultimately what happened in that case is the young man told me that he didn't think he was actually on school grounds, that the sidewalk that he was skateboarding on he thought was not considered school grounds. I went out to the scene, I looked at it, and then ultimately I went, back then you didn't have ready computer access. I went to City Hall and I pulled the plat, and the sidewalk that he was on was not, in fact, school grounds. And so I got that case dropped. And, that whole experience for me just, gave me, I don't know if it's the bug, but I then decided that I wanted to handle, criminal cases. And I wanted to represent people who had been charged with crimes. And it's really been a fascinating career. I've loved every minute of it.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right. So now we have a little idea of the Conviction Integrity Unit, their origins and what they do. Before we get into the case itself that we're going to talk about, can you tell, I did give some background on the Innocence Project and the Innocence movement in a previous podcast, but what would you say would be the difference between an Innocence Project, where we know there are approximately 70 in the States and around the world now, and a Conviction Integrity Unit?
I think probably the process is very similar. Where the state attorney's office Conviction Integrity Unit has an advantage is that I have ready access to, all of the information that I need. So if you're an Innocence Project or somebody that works outside of the state attorney's office, to get information, typically what you're doing is you're submitting a public records request. And then the state attorney's office pulls their file and they make a copy of it and they send it to you. And, while the fee is relatively minimal, there is a fee for that. So if you're a defendant in prison, you may not be able to afford the fee that's associated with that. Now, Innocence Projects of themselves can typically afford the fee, but it's a process. So, I am able to go and I get the file out of storage and I start looking through it, and I'm not having to wait on a public records request. And then, of course, our office, typically has a relationship with law enforcement, and I'm able to pull or request that law enforcement pull their file. If there's something that's still in property, I'm able to go to the property room and look at the evidence. We have a relationship with the clerk's office, and sometimes evidence is stored at the clerk's office. And so certainly my ability to access information is much different, and I would think easier to access than, one of the Innocence organizations. And so I think that's a really significant, piece.
Difference.
And, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That it sounds that way because I've heard our executive director talk about how difficult it is sometimes to get, whether it's DNA or anything, that the delay, he has to go back to court and time is going by. And you're describing something that is much speedier. So that's an interesting difference. I didn't know that myself. So the case itself, how was the Williams-Myers case picked up by the CIU?
Okay, so when Melissa Nelson was elected and started in January of 2017, the Times-Union, which is our local newspaper, ran, I think, 2 articles discussing, what was her platform going to be, and the fact that she was thinking about starting a conviction integrity unit. And so the way I understand the story from Mr. Myers is that one of his friends in custody with him saw the newspaper article in the Florida Times-Union and then passed it to him and brought his attention to the fact that Melissa Nelson was considering starting a conviction integrity unit. So based upon that article, Mr. Myers then wrote our office a 4-page letter sort of setting forth, his position, what his claims were. So when I started in January of 2018, this letter that Mr. Myers had written in 2017 had been here in the office for many months, in addition to 80 other letters. So when I started, there were 80 letters, 80 people who had written and were waiting for the unit to get started. And so I just started reading. I started reading letters and trying to process, how we were going to manage, this, what our policies and procedures were going to look like. But, as I came across Mr. Myers' letter, the tone and tenor of it was particularly striking to me. As a former criminal defense attorney, what he was saying rang true to me. It made sense to me. It was very logical. And I was thinking to myself, certainly if what he is saying is true, if there's some, credibility and some veracity to what he was saying, that this could be, problematic and certainly something that would fall within, our policies. So I then started investigating it. Mm-hmm.
Were you surprised or shocked at how long, by the time he wrote in 2017, he had been behind bars?
Well, certainly. I was born in 1970, and so I was 6 at the time, right, that Mr. Myers was convicted. And so I'm now pushing 50 myself, and so I look at it as almost my entire lifetime. That's Mr. Right. Williams and Mr. Myers, were in prison.
So he writes to the Conviction Integrity Unit. The letter sits there for a while because you hadn't actually gotten started. And then what were the next steps as you decided to go ahead and work on the case?
So in his case, as in with all of the cases that we're reviewing, my next step is to look. So what I do, if there's something that, grabs my attention in the letter. So right now what we're doing is we're receiving letters. We receive letters from, typically it's inmates around the state of Florida write us letters. Surprisingly, I anticipated originally that I would hear from defense counsel, but that hasn't really been the case. I've probably had a dozen cases or less that have been initiated by defense counsel. So typically what's happening is I'm getting a letter from an inmate, and the majority of those letters aren't giving me enough information for me to make a decision as to whether or not it's something that I can pursue. So I have come up with a petition, so to speak, that I then send back to the inmate, and I ask them to fill out the petition to give me more detail, what I'm specifically looking for. So by the time these gentlemen, and it's typically men, although there have been a few women, by the time these individuals are writing to me, they've been in custody for, a lengthy period of time. And their mind, what they're thinking is post-conviction, case law, post-conviction, and they have a really hard time getting away from the legal aspects of things. And what I'm really wanting to know is, the innocence side of it. So you don't have to tell me about